So I'm very lucky to be joined by Ollie Wiggins, who is currently a lead creative at BBC Studios. So thank you very much for joining me.
Pleasure.
So let's begin with a bit about you. You've been a director at Channel 4, you've been an ITV Studios creative, a producer at Disney, you've made your own short films and commercials, I believe. So I'd just like to know, before we go any further, where you started from and where you've got to where you are today, really.
So I was at the University of York, and as you say, I studied English literature. But I did my course with a particular focus on film, and I entered some kind of film competitions in York as well, some national film competitions, and was kind of a finalist in a couple of those, and also made films for companies in York. By the time I graduated, I already had kind of a reel of work. I applied to Channel 4, and I got a job there directing online films. Then I worked at ITV for a couple of years, where I directed bits and pieces, then worked at Disney Channel for a bit. I did a bit of directing, bit of editing, bit of producing, got to grips with the Disney brands, which at the time there was a few different channels. Now it's all obviously just Disney Plus. Kind of a good exercise in learning how different brands work, because they've got very strict kind of guidelines about how they like to market their content. So that was really useful. And then I freelanced for a bit and worked at the BBC for a bit as a creative and a lead creative.
So obviously you've done the editing, you've done directing and filmmaking across commercial and kind of fictional. Would you say you prefer working in the commercial marketing side of things or the more storytelling fictional side of things? I understand they can be closely related at points. What's kind of your favorite, would you say?
I really enjoy the storytelling stuff. You know, in my own work, I like to do short films, fictional films. I've kind of ended up doing things that aren't so story-based. I'd really like to sort of transition across to doing more story-based things.
So talking about the BBC for a minute, LGBTQ representation is improving very quickly, I think generally, the BBC included. So generally, where do you think LGBTQ representation stands in the TV industry today, and do you think the BBC or BBC Studios is doing enough to increase representation in that regard?
I should say I'm not speaking officially on behalf of the BBC, so
Yeah.
what I'm saying is really just my own opinions. I think that representation, as you say, has got a lot better. Doctor Who, I think, did a large part in kind of bringing that to sort of a mainstream audience. You know, I think it did really well in kind of having everyday well, not every day, obviously it's science fiction, but you know, stories that lots of people can appreciate, but with kind of LGBT themes kind of peppered throughout, but still with a kind of broad appeal. So it's not specifically LGBT focused, but people, whatever their sexual orientation, can watch the show and enjoy it. Whereas I think shows like It's a Sin, absolutely brilliant, of course, but tend to maybe just appeal to people in that community already. In terms of if we're doing enough, I think to keep listening to people from the LGBT community to find out what kind of programs they want and if they feel that they're being represented fairly.
Everybody wants more LGBTQ representation, but not just kind of for the sake of it, as you say, the kind of normal everyday storylines, with representation just kind of being a byproduct of that. The BBC, I've been looking at some of their diversity and inclusion plans, which were recently released. And the lowest scoring area in the survey was recruitment and progression, which was at 36% satisfaction. And there's lower average satisfaction among LGBTQ employees. So why do you feel that BBC employees who identify as LGBTQ are finding that there's less opportunities in recruitment and progression for them?
Again, that's a really interesting question. I wouldn't like to sort of say anything that sounds like it's coming from the BBC.
Yeah, your own opinion. I will reflect that.
I feel like the BBC can be quite hard to progress generally. You know, there's the adage that, you know, you're waiting to fill dead man's shoes, that, you know, you sort of need someone at the top to die off before people can move up. Career progression is quite hard in the BBC. I think just the nature of the company, that they can't create roles. As to why people from the LGBT plus community specifically feel like they can't progress, I haven't myself experienced any homophobia or seen that in the workplace. They take things like workplace harassment or bullying of any kind incredibly seriously. If I had any problems, or if I'd seen homophobia or bullying, or, you know, people being overlooked for things I thought they deserved, then I definitely feel I could raise those.
I think that's the response I've had from other people familiar with working at the BBC. They think it's very supportive and open to everybody. And would you say that's something you found across your career at ITV, Channel 4, and particularly Disney and the BBC? Would you say that in every aspect of diversity, everybody has been very, very accepting in the film and TV industry?
Well, I think different broadcasters and different companies do lots of different things very well. I think Channel 4, you know, really is all about diversity. I think that's really kind of part of the fabric of the company. I think now we're hearing about it being privatized. I think that's really kind of worrying, because I think Channel 4 is so much about serving underrepresented communities in a way that I don't think any other broadcaster can claim to be or really is. I think their attention to racial diversity and serving people from disabled communities was really sort of second to none. There was sort of a sense that perhaps a lot of it was kind of London focused by the nature of the UK. A lot of kind of ethnic minorities tend to be in kind of the bigger cities and specifically London. When I transferred to ITV, something I noticed was that they were really representing regional diversity really well. Their talent on screen was maybe not as racially diverse, but was kind of from all across the UK.
Do you think Disney's on the same playing field as BBC and Channel 4, or are they even above? Are they doing even better?
When I worked there, we had Disney Junior, Disney XD, Disney Channel. They're all channels for kids, basically, for children and young teenagers. There wasn't a huge amount of LGBT plus representation. They just brought in a show called Andy Mac, and it had the first LGBT character on a Disney show, but we weren't allowed to air it in some countries. So I did ask about that, do we think that that is the right decision? They said, well, it's not really our responsibility to educate people to also change kind of perceptions. They were kind of there to serve a program, right? And I think to compare a broadcaster like ITV or Channel 4 to a big multinational company like Disney, it's probably not quite a fair comparison, because Disney is here to serve essentially the entire world, right? It's a huge company. They have to be careful of kind of cultural sensitivities in different countries, whereas the BBC and ITV generally make shows for the UK, and sometimes they will sell them abroad. But Disney, their whole remit really is to kind of serve the world. I think it's great that Disney's including LGBT plus characters in their films, in one of the Marvel films recently. But a lot of the LGBT plus scenes, like Sulu hugging his husband in Star Trek, and LeFou in Beauty and the Beast, and this scene about the gay date in Avengers, you can just sort of cut them out of the film, and the film works kind of as is, doesn't it? And then that can be sold off to China or whoever doesn't really like LGBT scenes in their films. So that is a shame, and I think it would be nice to see more films where the LGBT plus storyline is a kind of thread throughout it. I suppose Disney has to sell films to countries rather that aren't necessarily pro-LGBT. Fantastic Beasts, J.K. Rowling made a big deal out of Dumbledore being a gay character, and then when push came to shove and the Fantastic Beasts film starred Dumbledore, I think a lot of people were quite disappointed that his sexuality was kind of swept under the carpet a bit. So I think it's nice that we saw in the most recent film Dumbledore and his love interest Grindelwald. Again, I kind of felt like that could have just been cut out of the film if it had to be for the Chinese markets. So it would be nice to see, mainstream, big budget, blockbuster films where there's LGBT storyline or character, which feels kind of integral to the film, but isn't necessarily targeted purely at the LGBT community.
So you mentioned all these kind of small elements of LGBT representation, like the date scene in Endgame you mentioned, and all these, they seem very inconclusive, and they're just kind of there to please a certain demographic. But Disney aren't really doing anything for long-lasting change, or BBC or whoever. So in that instance, do you think it's better to have small representation that's very like a token gesture, or do you think it's better to not have the representation at all? What do you think would be better from a corporation's perspective?
When we look at how films were 10 plus years ago, when LGBT people tended to be the butt of jokes, I think we've come a long way. Even just having these kind of little token things. If you had a kind of character in a film who was, gay and his sexuality was maybe seen as kind of a bad thing, or maybe he's the only kind of baddie in the film and he's gay, and so there's nothing to kind of balance that out and say, well, actually you can have good gay characters too and good gay role models. I think it would be good to see more of that going forward.
Going back to the BBC a little bit, you might remember in 2017 it emerged that 10.6% of BBC staff identified as LGBTQ, and that was according to a Freedom of Information request from the Christian Institute. And that was quite a controversial figure. On-air presenters were calling it, quote, not impartial or neutral. So it's very controversial back in the day. And today, 8.9% of BBC staff identify as LGBTQ. That is the official figure. So there's an awful lot of labeling and statistics around staff who are disabled, LGBTQ, female, male, and all the rest of it. So do you think that in the film and TV industry, should there be workforce targets for employees who identify as LGBTQ, Or should there be targets for characters identifying as LGBTQ?
The idea of sort of counting the number of characters and saying, well, there's so many % of characters on screen from that community. I feel like stuff like that could hamper creativity, but I also think it's very important that we do have a guideline, maybe saying, okay, this year we're looking to commission a certain number of things relevant to the LGBT plus community. Also maybe kind of give a remit to writers and say, look, in your dramas that you're writing, whatever it is, we'd really like you to look to include positive representations of LGBT characters on screen.
Yeah, and recently the BBC, at the end of 2021, they pulled out of the Stonewall Diversity Champions programme. And that was meant to promote LGBTQ representation in the workplace. And that was quite a controversial decision to pull out. Worries around impartiality and bias, which is understandable. The BBC needs to be impartial. Should impartial programming take the priority over LGBTQ representation? What are your thoughts around that?
I think the BBC has always been transparent that they have to be completely impartial. So that means, they support Pride, they don't support Stonewall, they support Black History Month, they don't support Black Lives Matter, the organisation. So I think that is consistent with the BBC's values of impartiality. They can support causes like Pride, they think are good, but they couldn't support a company or a charity. But I think that the BBC making that decision is in line with their values and their charter and remit.
Fair enough, yeah. A little survey I did for my own project, it was weighted towards a younger demographic. It was mostly my course mates, around 19 years old. And around 80% agreed that the BBC was moderately or extremely inclusive towards LGBTQ representation, which is quite good. I think BBC should be quite proud of that figure, hopefully. However, the BBC was ranked third when compared to the LGBTQ representation of Netflix, ITV, and Disney. Is this a kind of response you would expect, or do you think the BBC needs to be doing more?
I'm not speaking on behalf of the BBC. These are my personal opinions. Netflix obviously produces a huge amount of content, largely dramas and documentaries, where you can be weighted towards people from the LGBT community. But I think it can do because it targets the demographic who are interested in those programs, and even the people in the demographic who aren't from the LGBT plus community. People kind of in that 18 to 25 category, probably more likely to want to watch LGBT plus shows than, your sort of 50 plus year old BBC viewer. When you're making something like Life in the Country or, the kind of shows that are on the BBC, that it won't appeal to your demographic, I would suggest generally. I'm a bit surprised ITV came above Disney.
So was I, actually, yeah. Disney was last by quite a long way.
What shows has ITV done, or what programming has ITV done that you think sort of caters to that community?
Good question. I'm really not sure. I don't think. Yeah. I mean, BBC, I can think of quite a few off the top of my head. And Netflix, but ITV, I'm really not sure. Question.
The BBC comes under a lot of stick. I often hear people just sort of saying, "Oh, it's an insult to the license fee payer." Say it's too right wing, it's too left wing, it's not this, it's not the other. I do think there's a lot of BBC bashing, and I'm glad to hear that we didn't come last. That's good.
Overall, in my little survey, which isn't to be taken extremely seriously, but BBC had quite a positive response, I would say overall. Yeah. And just to kind of end with a little bit about where you are now, BBC Studios. It's very interestingly in the news at the moment, a record profit of over £200 million this year, which I think is the highest ever, which will be re-injected back into the BBC. As you're now at BBC Studios, kind of what do you envisage for the future of the company? I guess it is exciting times ahead.
The BBC has kind of come under fire from the government. I would argue that, it's for reflecting quite accurately in the news what's happening, and that's not always favourable. The government has sort of turned its attention to the BBC and, in my opinion, kind of started a sort of smear campaign, really, to make people dislike the company. And I think that is working. A lot of people really don't like the organisation. And I think, actually, if you look at the news from the BBC, it's really quite balanced. We have a lot of training. I don't work in news myself, but I have done some. And I know that the amount of attention that goes into making sure the news is balanced and unbiased, there's a lot of work goes into that. So I think that's kind of made it a target of the government. And so I think it's really important that the BBC is looking for other streams of income in case they do lose the Royal Charter and don't get the licence fee payers' money. BBC Studios is really important in making sure that there is another stream of income coming into the BBC in case that money dries up.
Yeah, I mean, they're also doing a lot of licensing, the Doctor Who figures and whatnot, the charts of the license fee payment versus everything else, BBC Studios income and licensing. BBC Studios and licensing is only going up. So, as you say, the BBC is very much diversifying, which is great.